Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 239 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to thank some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Stacey Dawson, Brianna Goodrich, Lisa S, and Nobody Important. Nobody Important, you are important to me because I love you and appreciate you every single day. Thank you so much to everybody who has subscribed to the Patreon. It is much appreciated. And our film review this week. Our film review is The First Omen. The First Omen was released in 2024. It has 6.8 out of 10 on IMDb and 81% on Rotten Tomatoes. A young American woman is sent to Rome to begin a life of service to the church, but encounters a darkness that causes her to question her faith and uncovers a terrifying conspiracy that hopes to bring about the birth of evil incarnate. Now, judging by what people have been saying online about this, it's been pretty Marmite. This film has been a love it or hate it kind of film. Also, to point out, somebody messaged me a while ago and they were like, what does Marmite mean? So Marmite is like a spread that you have on sandwiches or toast or whatever in the UK. And it's one of those things that people either love it or hate it. So I'm pretty sure it was like their advertising campaign for a while that people either love it or hate it. But that's why I say a film is Marmite, because, you know, people have very polarised views about it. So as always, we're going to jump in with our likes column first. And I have to say I was very dubious about this film. I thought, I don't know how good this is going to be. And I don't know if I'm particularly arsed to watch it. But I'm happy to say that I was pleasantly surprised. I know there's going to be people listening to this and they're going to be like, what? It was terrible. But you know what? I kind of enjoyed it. I was invited to an influencer screening of this film. Did not go because I couldn't cope with the idea of meeting new people and having to talk to new people. I watch horror films on my own, generally on a Monday morning. That's eating cereal in my pajamas. That's when I watch horror films. So I do feel like they put a lot of thought into the story and really wanted to pay their respects to the things that made The Omen such a classic film. And I think it's important to remember that The Omen, like my memory of it, of watching it, is not that it was like, you know, edge of your seat, terrifying. It was more eerie, suspenseful. It was more of a kind of a slow burn, and I felt like they tried their best to pay their dividends to the original. So it is, like I said, it's a total slow burn, and they do not rely on Hollywoodized jump scares that we are seeing over and over and over again in films. And I'm really glad they moved away from that, because I do think that a jump scare heavy film, it isn't clever. That's not good scares, you know. That's not the type of thing that's going to give you nightmares. It's just an instant jump, and it's very annoying. I find jump scares in horror films very annoying, especially when they are overused and not necessary to the plot. So there were a few moments of jump scares in this film, but they were so kind of few and far between that it didn't feel overused, and they were effective when they were used. And the thing that I loved most about this film was the music. Oh, it was just delicious, if you can describe music like that, which I just did, so you definitely can. It was that kind of same, like, shrieking, warbling terror of the original Omen. Lots of religious chanting, lots of sudden discordant notes. Honestly, I feel like I could give this film 5 out of 5 just for the musical score alone, because it just, it was divine. It was suitably eerie and freaky and made me feel uneasy. That is what you want from music and horror film. You want to be listening and going, oh, this is making me feel uncomfortable and I'm not quite sure why. And I really liked the opening sequence of this film. I wrote in my notes initially, I can't remember what the opening sequence was, to be honest, but I wrote down that I liked it and that it had lovely throwbacks to the original. But since I've written that, I have remembered the opening sequence. And it did indeed have lovely throwbacks to the original, which I'm not going to spoil here. But I was immediately like, okay, I know what this film is going to be. I know what this film is trying to set up. And I'm here for it. And you know what else I loved? I loved the nuns. So this novice nun is sent to Rome to this convent. And the convent takes in orphaned children or children of unwed mothers. And everybody's having a nice time. A lot of nuns in horror films in particular tend to be like, oh, this is a really freaky nun. This is a nun that's like, really aggressive or really dangerous, blah, blah, blah. Actually, these nuns were good crack. Do you know? They were funny. They were flawed. They were people. They made jokes. They were human, They were actually nice for the most part. They looked after the kids pretty well. They made dirty jokes. There's a great scene where all the female nuns, what a stupid thing to say, where all the nuns, kind of young and old, are sitting around together making dirty jokes about men that they used to know before they became nuns. And you know what? I was like, yes, you're normal. Just nuns. Normal nuns. I'm here for that. And I am saying that outside of the terror of the storyline of this film, but for the most part, when we see the nuns, they're having a good time, and I liked that. I also, my last thing that I wrote on the things that I liked, I appreciated the depiction of the absolute horror of childbirth. I've never given birth to a child, but I have plenty of people in my life who have given birth to a child, and you know what? That shit is brutal. That shit is brutal. And they do a good job in this film without any of the supernatural horror or the Antichrist horror. They do a really good job of demonstrating just how horrific childbirth is. And I was like, yeah, I can get on board with that. Totally. And fundamentally, I thought that this film was everything Immaculate wanted to be, but Immaculate didn't quite get there. I talked in detail in my review of Immaculate how I just didn't particularly enjoy it, and I respected that there was a conversation to be had about forced birth and forced pregnancy and all that kind of stuff, but I did think any kind of feminist conversation was kind of rudely and abruptly halted by the over-sexualization of the young nuns in the film, and particularly the over-sexualization of Sydney Sweeney. Felt kind of off to me. But all that being said, in terms of dislikes, it is a slow burn. I put it in the likes column too, because some people like a slow burn, but others really dislike a slow burn, and that can be a no-no for a lot of watchers, And I think fundamentally it will always live in the shadow of the original. It will just never be as good. And that's not to say it's not a good movie. It just has this mountain of a movie to live up to. And there were a lot of disgruntled reviews about messing with the canon. And I don't know enough about the Omen canon to kind of go, well, actually, or agree or disagree. But I know that a lot of people were annoyed. There were also elements of the film that I just felt weren't well-rounded enough and left me kind of scratching my head a bit. It's always possible that in my easily and eternally distracted state that I missed bits, but I did feel like elements of the actual narrative, the actual story, were a bit weak. Like there was a point where a character knew some information and I just couldn't for the life of me figure out how they knew that information. I don't know if that was meant to be part of the narrative where we were meant to be confused about how he knew that information. I don't know. I was a bit like, what? How do you know that? And then, inexplicably, there's characters who help the protagonist where I'm like, why are you suddenly helpful? Like, what's changed? What's going on? But overall, I kind of liked it, you know? I thought it was decent. The actress who played Margaret, the protagonist of the story, Nell Tiger Free, I really liked her performance. I thought she was believable. I enjoyed it. I liked her. I thought she was good. And I mean, look, is this film going to blow your mind? Probably not. But is it decent? Absolutely yes. And I know the people who were vehemently against this film in the comments of the post that I put on social media are going to be like, absolutely not. This was not good. I'm sorry. I'm giving this film 3.5 stars. 3.5 stars. I'm doing it. And nobody can stop me. It's 3.5 stars for me for the first Omen.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.
This is a paid advertisement from BetterHelp. As a podcast listener, you've heard from us before. Today, let's hear from our members about what online therapy has done for them.
I would recommend my therapist 1,000 times over. She has truly changed my life.
The day after my first session, my friends and family said I sounded like myself again for the first time in weeks.
You deserve to invest in your well-being. Visit BetterHelp.com to see what it can do for you. That's BetterHelp.com.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, our story was recommended by Michelle Groves, who sent in this recommendation via email quite a long time ago, actually. So if you ever have sent in a recommendation for an episode or a suggestion for an episode via email, I do keep them. I might not get to them quickly, but I keep them, and I will get to them eventually. So thank you to Michelle for sending in this suggestion. It ended up being a really interesting story and taking me on a bit of a rabbit hole journey into Roman soldiers. So let's get into it. York, a historic city in North Yorkshire in England, is a place where the past and present coexist in a vivid tapestry of culture, architecture and tradition. Its rich history stretches back nearly 2 millennia, making it one of the most fascinating cities in England. The story of York begins in 71 AD when the Romans established a military fortress here, naming it Eboracum. The fortress was strategically positioned at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, and it quickly grew into a thriving settlement. Eboracum became one of the most important cities in Roman Britain, serving as a base for the northern campaigns and even hosting Emperor Septimus Severus, who died here in 211 AD. York's significance continued under Constantine the Great, who was proclaimed emperor in the city in 306 AD, marking it as a pivotal location in the Roman Empire. With the fall of the Roman Empire, York entered a period of decline, only to rise again under the Angles, who renamed the city Eoforwic. The 7th century saw York become the capital of the Kingdom of Northumbria, and it emerged as an important religious centre. The establishment of the archbishopric in 735 AD cemented its ecclesiastical importance, and the city's minster became a centre of Christian learning and influence. The Viking era brought a new chapter to York's history. In 866 AD, the city was captured by the Norse warrior Ivar the Boneless, and it was renamed Jorvik. Under Viking rule, York flourished as a major hub of trade and commerce, connecting the British Isles with the wider Viking world. The Jorvik Viking Centre, a popular tourist attraction today, provides a vivid recreation of this period, allowing the visitors to experience the sights, sounds and smells of Viking Age York. The Norman conquest in 1066 brought significant changes to York. William the Conqueror recognised the city's strategic importance and constructed 2 imposing castles to assert control over the north. The medieval period saw York become one of England's most important cities. Its wealth and status were reflected in the construction of York Minster, one of the largest Gothic cathedrals in Europe. Begun in 1220 and completed in 1472, the Minster remains a symbol of the city's historical and architectural significance. York's medieval prosperity was fueled by its position as a centre of trade, particularly in wool, which was England's most valuable export. The city's merchants grew wealthy, and their legacy can be seen in the many medieval buildings that still stand today, including the Merchant Adventurers Hall and the Shambles, a picturesque street lined with timber-framed houses. The city also played a notable role during the War of the Roses, a series of dynastic conflicts in the 15th century. Richard III, who had strong ties to York, was popular in the city, and his death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. The Tudor and Stuart periods brought both prosperity and turmoil to York. The city was a stronghold for the Royalists during the English Civil War, and had withstood a siege by parliamentarian forces in 1644. Despite the city's eventual surrender, its architectural heritage remained largely intact. The Industrial Revolution in the 19th century transformed York once again. The arrival of the railway in 1839 turned the city into a major transport hub. The establishment of the confectionery industry, with companies like Rowntree's and Terry's, added to the city's economic growth. This period also saw the construction of many of York's iconic Victorian buildings, including the York Railway Station, which was once the largest in the world. Today, York is a vibrant city that balances its rich historical legacy with modern amenities and attractions. The city's ancient walls, which encircle the historic core, offer a scenic walk with views of York Minster and the picturesque streets below. Festivals such as the Jorvik Viking Festival and the York Mystery Plays celebrate the city's diverse heritage. York's history is a dynamic story of conquest, commerce and culture. And of course, a city that is so steeped in a vast and rich history is inevitably steeped in ghost stories too. York is often affectionately called the City of 1,000 Ghosts. Its rambling streets are jam-packed with haunted locations, and visiting the ghosts of York is inevitably going to take more than one episode. There is the York Castle Museum, where there have been reports of sightings of a man in Edwardian clothes. The Black Sheep Brewery, which was once a morgue and a vicarage, has a history of poltergeist activity. The Cathedral, the Golden Fleece, Ye Old Star Inn and the Black Swan Hotel are just some other extremely haunted locations in York, and judging by that non-exhaustive list, it is little wonder that York is often hailed as the most haunted city in Europe. Today's episode centres and begins on the Treasurer's House, a picturesque townhouse nestled in the centre of York that has many strange stories to tell. It was 1953, and Harry Martindale was only 18, a fresh-faced apprentice plumber who was keen to do a good job. Especially this one. He had to get this one right. The job was in the Treasurer's House, a building that had been at the centre of town for centuries. And for Harry, who had grown up in York, it was an iconic building. And he was just really excited to get the chance to do some work there. The first treasurer for York Minster was appointed in 1091. So the building had been around in some shape or form for a really long time. It had seen life and death, servants and royalty, and had a rich history. But this building needed to move with the times, and it was Harry's job to lay the pipes for the new central heating system that was being installed. It involved working in the cellar, which was daunting. But also, Harry felt a real, genuine, deep sense of pride and responsibility. As Harry descended into the cellar, he set about finding a piece of level ground to prop up his ladder and begin his work. It was back-breaking work, knocking holes in the ceiling to accommodate new pipes, teetering on an admittedly perilously placed ladder. When he heard the sound of music in the distance, he noticed it, but didn't pay much attention. Probably some event or something out on the grounds or out on the street. He continued with his work. Then he heard it again. It was closer this time, and he realised that it wasn't music. It was a horn playing individual notes, and it was coming closer. Harry was confused. The sound of the horn was steadily advancing. The sound of footsteps marching, lots of them. Harry realised with a stunned apprehension that the sound was coming from behind the very wall that his ladder was propped up against. He lowered his chisel. The sound still steadily advancing, and pressed his ear against the cold stone wall. The sound grew and swelled around him, growing louder and louder. He no longer needed his ear pressed against the stone. The sound was filling the silence of the cellar around him, echoing against the stone walls, deafening and clear. A movement to his side made Harry glance down, and from the top of the ladder he saw it. A red mass emerged from the wall, bursting forth in a splash of colour against the grey surroundings. It took Harry a second to understand what he was seeing. He was looking down at the plumed helmet of a soldier. Harry momentarily forgot where he was and what was happening. In shock, he stepped backwards off the ladder, landing in a heap on the cellar floor, with the soldier still advancing. He scrambled to the corner of the cellar, still on all fours, and pressed his back against the wall, watching the scene unfold in front of him. The first soldier was now in full view. As Harry stared, he realised with confusion that the soldier was strangely small. And as he scanned the soldier's body, Harry realised that the reason he looked so small was because the soldier was only visible from the knees up. Then the horse appeared. Harry audibly gasped in shock, then quickly covered his hand with his mouth, desperate for these men not to notice him. Could they hurt him? Is that why they were here? He wasn't keen to find out. There was another soldier sitting astride the horse, and then more soldiers came in twos, marching through the cellar, staring straight ahead. Harry wasn't in the frame of mind to count exactly how many soldiers marched through the cellar, but he believed that there had been at least 20. And as he watched them, he realised that he could only see them from the knees down, until they reached a part of the cellar where the floor looked slightly different. And then he could see them from the sandals on their feet to the plumes on their helmets. He had only ever seen Roman soldiers in books and films, and those soldiers were always neat and gleaming. And these soldiers, these bizarre invaders of this dark cellar, were wearing uniforms, yes, but they looked tired and rough, like they'd been on the road for a long time. Harry did not know what was happening, but he was 100% certain that whatever this was, he should not be seeing it. Whatever these things were, they should not be in this cellar with him in the year 1953. These soldiers were not hazy or transparent. They looked as real as Harry himself. The only difference was that they were literally walking through the wall, as though it wasn't even there. They didn't notice or interact with Harry in any way. They simply marched with their eyes forward, looking dejected and seemingly mumbling quietly to one another. Once they'd passed through the cellar and no more soldiers emerged, Harry scrambled to his feet. He had never felt terror like what he had just experienced. His heart was hammering in his chest. He was covered in a sheen of cold sweat. Every hair on his body seemed to be standing on end. He scrambled to his feet and fled up the stairs, breathing hard. He ran straight into one of the caretakers of the building, an older man who immediately saw that something was wrong with Harry. He was pale and trembling, and his eyes were wild in his head. Harry spluttered and stammered. He couldn't find the words to explain what he had seen, but the caretaker looked at him and said, "You've seen the soldiers, haven't you?" Harry didn't return to the house for 25 years. Now, the story is interesting, but it is also compelling. Initially, it seemed from sources that people didn't believe him until he went into detail. His account described uniforms that were incredibly specific to Roman soldiers in the 1st century. These uniforms weren't really informed by things that he had seen in films or on TV. He described them as follows. The metal helmet came under the chin here, and from where I was sat, with the single light on, I could see there was a growth of hair on the face. They had the coloured plumes coming out the top of the helmet, and as they were going past, I could see they were going down the side of the back of the head. They all wore the same thing. On the top, on the material, were strands of leather all the way around. And the only thing I can say they had on was a green coloured skirt. All of them carried a short sword on the right-hand side, the side nearest to me, and it was a short sword like an oversized dagger. The terror I felt was because I could see them exactly as I can see anyone else now, and I thought naturally all they had to do was glance to their right and see me in the corner, and obviously the terror was in case they'd do me any harm. But they didn't. They just looked ahead of them and went into the wall opposite. When the last one had cleared the cellar and gone through the wall and I couldn't see or hear anything else, then I made my escape out of there. Harry was no expert on Roman soldiers by any means, and the knowledge he possessed of this part of history was limited and patchy at best. And his description of these uniforms was incredibly specific. He had stated that the soldiers carried round shields, something that initially made people roll their eyes. Everyone knew that Roman soldiers had carried large rectangular shields. That was until later excavations of Hadrian's Wall showed that auxiliary Roman soldiers did in fact carry smaller round shields. That wasn't the only compelling thing about this experience. He had only seen the soldiers from the knees up, making him initially think that they were really small. Where he had seen the soldiers was exactly where there was an old Roman road. The treasurer's house had been built right over it, and during tentative excavations, they had been able to uncover some of it in the cellar. The bit of the cellar floor that looked different to the rest, and the bit of the cellar floor where Harry could see the soldiers from the sandals up. And these weren't the only reports of Roman soldiers that had been seen around the UK. West Mersey Island is in Essex, on the east coast of England, and it was at one point a very strategic place for Roman soldiers. There was an important Roman road and a huge burial site in the area, and throughout the years there have been reports of the sounds of soldiers marching or horses galloping, and the sounds of horses and carts moving through the area. One local resident stated, "One night my friend and I came back from Colchester. We'd been to one of the pubs there and had a few drinks and saw some of our girlfriends and that. We came back onto Mersey Island over the Strood, on the East Mersey Road, and we turned into Dawes Lane about 400 yards up the road. where there was a pond and haystacks. It's a misty night. In the headlights, this figure came out between the pond and the haystacks, walking towards the mound. And he looked like a Roman centurion. He had a helmet on, with an eagle on the front. He had a shield and a sword. He had a uniform on, and he sort of had a red skirt, but you couldn't see his legs. And we stopped the car, and my friend said, "We'll have him tonight." And he jumped out of the car, and I followed. We got about 400 yards in the road where there's a mound, a Roman mound with an opening in it. And he sort of looked at us, and then he disappeared. And that's not the only eyewitness testimony from the area. We were coming along Mersey Strood one evening around 12 o'clock. It was high tide and the full moon. And as we were going along the Strood, I happened to look across the opposite side of the road, and there was somebody walking along. And I looked, and it was the Roman ghost. And I said to my husband, "Oh look, there's the Roman ghost." And my husband said, "Don't be so silly. What on earth are you on about?" We turned around and came back. And we came along slowly, and I wound my window down on my side, because I was on the near side, and I had a look. And there was this Roman. And my husband saw him as well. He was all dressed up and holding his 2 spears. And he had a leather sort of skirt on, and he was sort of very upright and straight. And he was quite a large man, and he was just looking straight ahead. He was looking, all his face was all a rounded face, and his eyes were just looking straight ahead. And we were further up and turned around, and when we turned around and came back, he had just completely disappeared. And the water was at high tide. It was level with the pavement. There were no boats, no cars, not a bicycle, nothing, and he had just completely gone. So it seems that Roman soldiers are a common vision across the UK. And in the research for this episode, I came across one more story that I thought was really worth sharing. It was the 2nd of January 1950, and a woman named Miss E.F. Smith attended a cocktail party in the little town of Brechin in the west of Scotland. She left the party late and had had a lovely night and hopped into her car to drive home. Home was the village of Letham, and it was 10 miles away. En route home, it was clear that the conditions were not suitable for driving. It was pitch dark, and it had snowed and then rained, so the roads were treacherous. 2 miles outside Brechin, she lost control of the car and skidded into the ditch, and the result was that she had to make the rest of the journey home on foot. She knew the roads well and decided that she would be able to complete the 8-mile journey home. It was a relatively isolated road. There were farms scattered here and there, but she had her little dog for company. She was exhausted, and her dog was equally as exhausted and had to be carried the last 2 miles. As she neared home, she was faced with a conundrum. She could take a well-used shortcut through a dark and dense woods, or she could continue onto the open country road. She chose the latter. Although she was road-weary, she had no desire to cut through the woods. In short, she was frightened of them at night time. As she peered ahead into the darkness, she realised that there were lights moving in the distance. Lots of pinpricks of light were coming into view. She couldn't make out what they were, and had no idea what they could be. She was perplexed, but continued onwards. And then the people came into focus. The lights were flaming torches carried by a shadowy group of men. And to her right she caught sight of more lights. Another group, maybe a third of a mile away, that was coming towards the first group. She felt the little dog on her shoulder bristle, and he began a low guttural growl. With a dawning horror, she became terrified that the dog was going to bark and draw attention to her. She made her way home safely that night, but it was decades before she spoke about what she had seen. She was visited by a Dr. James McHarg, who was from the Society of Psychical Research, and she readily told him her story in as much detail as she could remember. According to Andrew MacKenzie in his book Hauntings and Apparitions, this is what she had seen. Miss Smith said that at the beginning of the first phase, in the distance, straight ahead, she saw quite a lot of torches. Miss Smith felt that what she was seeing had not suddenly started, but that it had already been going on when she came upon it. Her recalled reaction was to say to herself, "Well, that's an incredible thing." Speaking about the nearest figures of all, which she watched during the third stage of her experience, Miss Smith said, "They were obviously looking for their own dead. The one I was watching, the nearest one, would bend down and turn a body over, and if he didn't like the look of it, he just turned it back on its face and went on to the next one. There were several of them. I suppose they were going to bury them." When asked about clothing, Miss Smith said they looked as if they were in, well, I would have said brown, but that was merely the light. Anyway, dark tights, the whole way up, a sort of overall with a roll collar, and at the end of their tunics there was a larger roll around them too. And it simply went on looking like tights until it reached their feet. I did not see what was on their feet, but they weren't long boots. Miss Smith asked about the torches the figures she saw were carrying. She replied, they were carrying very long torches in their left hands. Very red. Afterwards, I wondered what on earth they had been made of. Tar, I suppose. Was there tar in those days? Miss Smith had long since come to the conclusion that what she had seen was the aftermath of a battle. She was aware that a long time ago this particular area had seen a battle, but she was unfamiliar with the details. The battle had been one that had fallen into obscurity, at least for the general public. I'll give you the shorthand version of this battle. It was called the Battle of Nectansmere, and it was fought in May 685. The fight was between the indigenous Picts and an invading Saxon army. The Picts were victorious, and the victory resulted in the securing of the independence of the Scottish kingdoms. So while it was widely forgotten, it was at the time an important fight. This was the Dark Ages, and the battle was scarcely recorded, but there were interesting things that matched with Miss Smith's description. She described the dress of 7th century Pictish warriors, specifically. Their dress and weapons had been recorded at the time in old carvings. She described how their torches that they carried seemed to glow red, and interestingly, Pictish warriors made their torches out of the resinous roots of Scots fir, which have a distinctively red colour. But that's not the most compelling bit. She described the warriors moving across the terrain and turning over bodies, but she said that they seemed to be skirting around something on the land. She wasn't quite sure what it was that they were avoiding. Centuries earlier, there had been a lake on the land that had been drained to allow for the growth of agriculture. It was discovered through aerial surveying of the land that a finger of the lake had extended onto the exact piece of land where Miss Smith had seen the soldiers. That was what they were skirting around. They were avoiding the lake. Okay, we are going to stop there, kids. And as always, the links to all of the sources that I use for this episode are in the description of this episode, where you can peruse them freely. There's also a lovely video in there that is Harry Martindale telling his story himself. So that is well worth a watch. But we're going to go right back to the beginning. Firstly, York is one of those places that I have said time and time again has been on my to visit list, and I still haven't gotten the chance to go there. Not only for the history. I'm somebody who I love Richard III, the play specifically, the Shakespeare play. So anything that's Richard III adjacent, you best believe I'm there. And also, I've seen so many videos on TikTok about people eating food in York, in the Shambles specifically, and holy moly, the food in York looks beyond delicious, okay? I have a folder in my TikTok that is just food to eat when I go to York. That, honestly, so, you know, I'm serious about my visit to York. There's going to be food eaten and there's going to be ghosts hunted. But it really is no surprise that York has so many ghost stories. Like, the history is just so rich and varied, and you've got so many times that York has changed hands in terms of leadership, who took it over. You've got Vikings, you've got Romans, etc. Do you know what I mean? So a lot of shit went down there, and I think that Harry's story is really compelling. Like, I really do think that, and I think he is a really believable witness. You know, and I'm not saying that some witnesses are more believable than others, but you know, when you watch somebody and you think, God, something happened to you. I don't know what that something is, but something happened to you. And I did read other stuff where he went and found like some of the other people who had also experienced the soldiers aside from the caretaker, and he compared stories with those people and they seem to have all seen something similar. I also want to point out that apparently the horn sound that you heard in this particular episode, I used a horn sound from a YouTube video of a Roman horn in order to get an accurate Roman horn sound. So the video was called Reproduction of an Ancient Roman Cornu Used During the Roman Empire between 200 BC to 476 AD, which is a channel called Brass from the Past. That is the length that I go to when I'm making these videos, trolling through videos of people playing old horns in order to get an authentic sound. I'm going to add to that and say that if you're feeling like at a loose end and you would like to spend some time looking up old war horns, I would recommend you doing that. The old Celtic war horn is pretty good. The old Aztec death whistle, also pretty good, pretty exciting. But to go back to Harry's story, like, I do think it's interesting that he had said, you know, they had these round shields and people were like, boo, everybody knows Roman soldiers didn't have round shields. And then it turned out, auxiliary soldiers did have round shields. I also think it's really interesting that he was talking about these soldiers and saying, look, they didn't look shiny and well put together. They looked worn out. They looked dirty and dusty and tired and miserable. Because depending on what those soldiers had been doing, they probably were tired and miserable and dusty and dirty. So it makes sense that, you know, seeing them in this particular guise, that they wouldn't look well put together. And it seems to me that what Harry was seeing and that other people had also seen was almost like some sort of time slip, or at least something residual. Especially when you consider the details of him only seeing them from the knees up and then realising, oh my God, that's where the original Roman road was. And then I included the stories of the Mersey Island. I think it's really interesting that this place that was a strategic Roman stronghold, that they had garrisons there and they had burial mounds there and a very important Roman road, that people have been seeing Roman soldiers walking along. I did love the idea that the first two men in the story who are on their way home from the pub, that his friend is like, we'll have him tonight. What are you going to do? Fight him? Like, fight him if he's a real man, or fight him if he's a ghost? Which one are you planning on doing? Or both, or either? Either way, it's a stupid idea. And I have to say, the last story, the story of Miss E.F. Smith and her cocktail party, and then seeing this battle, or the aftermath of this battle afterwards, I just loved it for lots of reasons. First of all, this woman is going to a cocktail party. Good on her, okay? You go and have a good time. And this woman in this article where I got this story was described as a spinster. She's like a woman in her 50s. She's a single woman. She's going to cocktail parties with her dog. She's living a great life. And spinster feels like such a pejorative term to use to describe that lifestyle. Now, granted, I will say going to a cocktail party and being full to the gills of cocktails and then getting into your car and to drive home is nicked so good. We're not happy about that. We do not condone that whatsoever. And one would have to question whether it was the treacherous driving conditions or the copious amount of cocktails that caused her to drive her car into a ditch. And look, either way, she survived. The dog survived. She was okay. It just I need to point out that I don't approve of that part of the cool spinster life. But again, there's I can never say that word. There's a specificness to her story that I think is really interesting, you know, where she's talking about they're carrying these red flaming torches, and it turns out, oh, guess what? The Pictish warriors used red wood for their torches, and then she's talking about them, you know, skirting around a bit of the land, and she didn't quite understand why, and she talks about their uniform, and they're turning over their dead to see if they need to pick up some of their fallen, you know. I mean, it's all very specific. And like I said, this was a battle that had sort of fallen into general obscurity. I imagine historians would have been aware of the stories, etc. But your sort of local lay people, I imagine, weren't aware of the stories. Now, there isn't an indication as to what our spinster did for work or was interested in. So is it possible that she had read all of these stories of the Pictish Saxon battle that had happened there? Maybe she did. Maybe she had a vested interest in it. She said afterwards that she knew that there had been a battle there between Pictish and Saxon warriors, but she wasn't aware of the ins and outs of it. She just knew that it had happened. She also claimed that she wasn't aware of like what a Pictish warrior's uniform would look like, or that there was a lake in that area previously, or any of those things. And there was an argument in the article that I read about this particular story that because it took her decades to actually tell the story, she had plenty of time to read about Pictish warriors, etc., and therefore fill in those blanks, fill in those details to make it more compelling and make it fit the narrative better. There was also the suggestion that she had also read a particular paper that was done by this person who had done the aerial photography of that part of Scotland and realised that there had previously been a lake in that area due to the aerial photography showing particular markers on the land that you wouldn't see when you're, you know, at ground level. So there was a suggestion that she had also read that particular paper, and therefore she was able to add in that really compelling and convincing detail about the lake being on the land, or at least the Pictish soldiers skirting around something that they later realised was this sort of finger of the lake that had stretched out over that piece of land. So maybe she did, you know, maybe she had gone and done loads of reading and found out loads about that particular battle and filled in the blanks, and therefore her story seemed more accurate and compelling. There was also a suggestion in that particular article that because it was that time of the year, so it was January, it was in the east of Scotland, so you're really in the northeast of the British Isles, and it was undoubtedly cold. She had had a skin full of cocktails. She had been in a car accident, so she was obviously in shock. She was exhausted. There was potential that she had hypothermia and that she began to hallucinate because of all of those factors. I mean, yeah, very real possibility. But also I don't want it to be any of those factors. I want it to be that this woman somehow, through a time slip or a residual energy or residual haunting, she saw the aftermath of this really obscure battle in history, and guess what? Her dog saw it too, because her dog started growling. That's what I want. That's what I want the story to be. I don't want it to be a reasonable explanation like she was full of drink and had hypothermia and therefore started to hallucinate and had read all of the stories about this particular battle and had recalled them in that moment of hallucination. I don't want it to be that. I also don't want her to have read loads about this particular battle over the years, and you know, when she was approached by the doctor from the Society of Psychical Research, she had already filled in the blanks to make the story more compelling. I also don't want it to be that, okay? I want these things to have actually happened because it just is far more entertaining to me. Oh, I did also forget to add that it was sort of widely accepted later on that the battle likely took place somewhere else. Years later, an academic said, I think the battle took place here. And I think the majority of academics agree with that. So, you know, I still believe her story, even if it is just because she's a cool spinster. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you to the wonderful Michelle Groves for the story recommendation. I thoroughly enjoyed this one, and it has only reinforced my desire to go to York. And like I said, if there are any sources that you wish to find, all of the sources that I used for the research of this particular episode, all of the links that I've used are in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And if you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website, reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.